Varun Badhwar is a three-time founder and a true luminary in the cybersecurity landscape. Currently at the helm of Endor Labs, a startup dedicated to software supply chain security. Varun has an impressive track record, including building Palo Alto Networks' cloud-native security business from the ground up and founding Redlock, which was acquired for a whopping $230 million. We'll dive deep into topics like the relevance of CVSs in today's AppSec world, the intriguing concept of VEX and its connection with SBOM, and the ever-evolving landscape of developer productivity. We'll also explore if the shift left movement has pushed the boundaries just a bit too far. We hope you enjoy this conversation with Varun Badhwar.
None of the top 50 university programs teach secure coding in their curriculum. At Security Journey, we help enterprises reduce vulnerabilities through application security education for developers and everyone in the SDLC. With over 400 up-to-date lessons created by industry-leading security experts and a programmatic approach that creates security champions, our program has increased AppSec knowledge as much as 85%. Visit securityjourney.com to try our training today.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Application Security Podcast. This is Chris Romeo. I am the CEO of Kerr Ventures and CEO of a stealth startup in the cybersecurity space. I'm also joined by Robert Hurlbut, who is broadcasting from apparently the largest room he could find.
That's right, yes. Hey, Robert Hurlbut. I am a principal application security architect and threat modeling lead at Acquia. And yeah, just been traveling and found a good place to broadcast today. And, you know, that's how it is, right? Sometimes you just have to figure out what works and go with it.
You got to broadcast from wherever you are. So Robert is in a ballroom of a hotel where you could have a good-sized wedding if you knew 500 people or more. It would be a perfect place. So let's jump in. Let's meet Varun, who is our guest today. And Varun, we always like to throw people right into the security origin story. So tell us about how you got into application security. What was your journey like?
Sure. So Chris and Robert, thanks for having me. You know, I've got a bit of a funny story. So I did my undergrad in computer science, and I just was a horrible software engineer. Like, didn't see myself writing code as my day job. But I love being kind of in the technology realm. And in that kind of, you know, soul searching phase, I happened to take an elective course in ethical hacking. And this was long before there was kind of degrees in cybersecurity available in undergrad programs. And I just loved the fact that you could break stuff and not go to jail. And I'm like, hell yeah, like, this is great. How do I find a job in this category? But, you know, we're talking 2006, people didn't hire folks out of college for cybersecurity jobs back then. And so I ended up getting two offers for kind of consulting, technology consulting, one from Deloitte, one from KPMG. And I basically played them against each other to say who would allow me into their kind of security consulting practice. And lo and behold, both did. And I ended up joining KPMG. Did that for a couple of years, ended up at Salesforce.com when there were 1,500 employees. I was the fifth hire in their security team. Saw this amazing kind of burst of activity in cloud. And, you know, honestly, in 2010, I look back to the last 4 years at Salesforce and said, you know, I know more about cloud security at this point than probably 95% of the market. And how do I use that to do something interesting, exciting, and pivoted to start building companies. So my first company called Cypher Cloud was the first ever CASB in the market. And, you know, the term CASB was defined 3 years later. And then did that for about 5 years and saw this next evolution of the move from data center to the cloud. Ended up starting a company called Redlock, which was acquired 3 years later by Palo Alto Networks, became Prisma Cloud as what it's known today. But again, it was a category defining company. Like if you think about cloud security, posture management, and CDAP, Redlock, Prisma Cloud were the creators at a large scale of that category. So, you know, been proud of the work we did there. But in that journey at Palo Alto Networks, I had 400 engineers on my team, and, you know, we were running SCA tools. We had 68,000 alerts, and this is right around the time when, you know, SolarWinds happened, and people were asking a lot of questions around software supply chain. And, you know, I just uncovered tremendous inefficiencies in the process. Like the tools want to check a box and tell you every possible thing that could be wrong. You shove that report and list to your engineers, and 8 out of 10 times, those things are just not relevant for the way your applications are being built by your developers. But what I absolutely kind of hated was it's a guilty until proven innocent model. The tools find the developers guilty, they give you the alerts, and ultimately the developers have to come back and fight for exceptions and convince you that they're innocent. Something is very wrong with that model. And that's kind of led me to the founding and genesis of Endor Labs, where we're working on really eliminating the developer productivity tax. And I'm sure we'll talk about more of that, but that's in essence who we are and what we do.
Yeah, very cool. So let's dive into that. What is developer productivity tax? What does that mean?
Yeah, look, when we hire software engineers, like the OKRs we typically have for them is how much code are they shipping, right? One fundamental problem we've had in security is like their OKRs are very different from somebody in security or application security. We'll get to that probably later. I think the fundamental thing around developer productivity tax is it's all of the unnecessary work that developers have to do above and beyond just securing their applications or developing by, secure by design. It's the stuff where they have to keep fighting to prove their innocence on lots of alerts from lots of AST tools that kind of make no sense for their particular use case or application. It's also fighting to deploy dozens of different security tools into your pipelines, which are constantly churning and changing. And you have 300 pipelines. It takes 2 weeks to deploy tools in certain pipelines. It's added work that is honestly not something that they are getting measured on, because their teams are saying, how fast are you building software? How fast are you shipping releases? And how good is the quality, right? Like ultimately, that's what most companies are measured on. And the third thing is this whole exception handling process, right? Like, Steek will say, you have 10,000 vulnerabilities. Okay, now the developer will take 8 hours per vulnerability to go review the report and determine what is relevant, what is not. CVSs prioritization sucks. We'll talk about why. It's fighting all of that bureaucracy in the process to just convince people that they should still keep doing what they're doing. That is the developer productivity tax. And where we see that tax being the highest today in the application security realm, first and foremost, if we acknowledge and agree that 80 to 90% of code in modern applications is code you didn't write, but you borrowed from complete strangers in the open source ecosystem, that is where a lot of your alert fatigue is coming in from, is SCA and open source governance in general. The second thing where the fatigue and alerts are coming in is secrets. Like if you think about it in the pipeline, we all want to put a secret detection tool. I mean, those tools could get really noisy really, really fast. What secret's valid? What is something that is historically there, but is not even a valid secret anymore? I've already kind of disabled it. How do I know who's tracking it? I got to keep parsing through these reports. And the third thing is the tax of just running all of these tools in the pipeline that are disconnected, not communicating with each other. And I have to constantly manage these because my security engineer wants me to, put a new tool in, and they want to POC a new tool, but all of that work keeps coming on me in DevOps to run those tools.
So let's talk about CVSs, because I know you've written a lot about CVSs. And so this might be a bit of a loaded question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What's the value of CVSs in the modern world of application security?
Look, it is one of many indicators that you probably should use to prioritize what you want to go work on next. The way I simplify the life of vulnerability management programs is there needs to be a now, next, and never list. So if we agree that there needs to be some kind of a model, you can call it whatever you like, but a now, next, never in my mind, the question is what is in the now list? I think the mistake a lot of organizations make is they will go look at alerts and outputs for any tool, I already mentioned Sneak. Let's just continue picking on Sneak. You'll take a Sneak report. You'll say criticals and highs, filter. Okay, I'm down from 300,000 alerts to 100,000 alerts. Okay, here goes Jira tickets for 100,000 things to my engineers. It doesn't make sense. First of all, that is one segment, an approach to looking at prioritization, but it's missing key factors. It has no context of exploit maturity. Is there even an actual exploit for this? Or is this a theoretical thing that some security researcher found that there's no real active attacks on? So we think things like EPSS, right? Exploit Predictability Scoring System, that is now getting a lot of industry standardization and recognition as a vendor neutral mechanism to look at exploit maturity, is another important indicator to add on. Beyond that, we think the biggest thing, the most relevant thing to your organization is your internal applicability of that vulnerability. What do I mean by that? 90% of your code is open source? Fine. What our research has found, only 12% of that 90% code is actually used in your application. So simple example, I'm using an AWS SDK. The AWS SDK supports 100 AWS services. My app is using EC2. If I'm only calling the function that connects me to EC2, and that is vulnerability free, why do I have to go drop everything and fix vulnerabilities in the Lambda function calls or the S3 calls that are part of that SDK, but that code is not even getting invoked in my application? And the fundamental knowledge around reachability, am I actually using the part of the code that has the vulnerability? Is it internet facing, right? All of these factors, is it a test dependency or is it in production, are super important. And we think you need a well-rounded aggregate mechanism to look at prioritization and risk. And by doing so, you can cut your list down by 90% and really focus the now on drop everything. Here are the critical with exploits that are mature, reachable in my application. Let's go fix those handful now. And let's get to everything else in my just regular release process and not disrupt the developer flow. That's kind of how we perceive, how prioritization should occur, not on a single metric.
Whenever I hear about reachability, I'm always curious to understand how do you truly measure reachability, though? Like, without being inside of the running application and having some type of observability layer that can see if something, like, how do you measure? Like, when you think about reachability, how is this thing measured? How do we know if something really is truly reachable?
Yeah, look, broadly speaking, there's two approaches here. And by the way, I completely agree. You've had speakers in the past come and talk about it. And Jim's talked about how SCA as it is today with scanning manifest files is dead. It really needs static analysis approaches and SAS techniques to do it. So one way is you do it statically. You do static analysis specifically to trace how your first party code is calling these dependencies, how those dependencies are calling those transitive dependencies, which functions are you calling, which ones are you not calling. It's a very hard computer science problem to do, but it can get you 80% of the way there. Okay, that's one way to do it statically, building a control flow graph. The other approach is doing it through runtime agents and kind of something dynamic in runtime. That is much more intrusive. As we know, every time trying to convince people to put something in security in runtime is hard. So people will kind of fall back and say, well, let's run it in test or run it in staging. The problem there with these runtime approaches is not only are they more intrusive, but they're also prone to false negatives because it's only as good as the mercy of your test code coverage. If the test codes are executing against 30% of your application, well, the only scenarios that are getting played out in your staging environment is to see if any of those libraries are getting loaded in that 30% of the calling application. So stepping back, you can do it statically, you can do it through runtime. Each one has its pros and cons. We fundamentally at Endor Labs made the bet that static techniques are going to be more efficient and scalable in the long run. Nobody wants another agent. I don't want to fight that battle with my SRE teams. I'm trying to reduce the tax, not add a tax. And so the way we do it is statically. We've built it for several libraries and programming languages. So we can do it for Java, Go, Python, C#, Rust, and others. But the technique is basically looking to say, which functions are you calling in your application? So that's one part of the problem. And how do you do it all the way down the transitive tree of your dependencies? There's a second part to this problem. No matter which approach you use, none of the existing CVE databases have the vulnerabilities annotated to the function. So you have a whole security research component that needs to go annotate these vulnerabilities to say, well, what part of that open source library, what function, what line of code was a vulnerability in? So then when I scan your code, I know what lines you're using. I know where the vulnerability is. I piece it together and I ship the results to you. So it kind of is a two-party problem, if you will.
So here's another question for you. We've heard this term VEX, but both Chris and we don't really know a lot about it. We want to learn more about it. So what is VEX, and how does it play with SBOMs?
Yeah, so let's kind of pick up where we were, right? We talked about importance of context of application, context of reachability, context of, is it actually a test dependency? Is it in production? It's context of, is there a fix even available? Like, great, you're telling me there's a vulnerability I should fix, but if the maintainer hasn't even shipped an upgrade, it's not. So there's a huge amount of context that's important to understand about set of vulnerabilities. So now let's tie this to SBOMs and then get to VEX. Okay. Well, what is SBOMs? To me, SBOM is a means to an end. We all want transparency in software. Makes a lot of sense. We all want to understand what are the ingredients of our software. Great. So an SBOM is basically writing, we're using this package, this version, this package, this version. Now, what do you expect somebody who gets an SBOM to do, right? So Chris sends me an SBOM. I am your consumer of Chris's application. I pick my favorite tool and I run Chris's SBOM against it, right? Let's say I take a WASP dependency track, I import it. That is going to tell me, hey, Chris's application has these 10,000 vulnerabilities. I have no context of Chris's application. I just know based on the version and the name of the packages, here are the 10,000 problems he has. I'm going to go back to Chris by email, send him a 10,000 line entries in a spreadsheet and say, Chris, why don't you fix these? Chris will go to the developer and say, development team, my customer is asking me all this stuff. Why didn't we fix this? Well, this is not a scalable, sustainable process. So as an industry, one thing is we talk a lot about SBOMs, but let's be pragmatic about what are we going to do about SBOMs? If we do what I just described, which is what a lot of the industry is doing, this is dead on arrival. Chris doesn't have the resources to scale. I don't have the resources to chase Chris down. Dead on arrival. We check a box and we call it a day. The way to make this much more practical is that the same body, NTIA, that created the SBOM standard, created a VEX, a Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange format. And they describe VEX as a companion document to SBOMs. And I call it, it's like SBOM without a VEX is like peanut butter without jelly. Because if Chris is sending an SBOM to me and I don't have the context of preemptively Chris telling me, look, your scanners might tell you there's 10,000 things. Here's reasons descriptively in a JSON format. I've chosen not to fix this because this is not applicable to me. This particular thing is not reachable. This thing doesn't have a fix available. This thing is a test dependency. I don't use it in production. That's the kind of context that the VEX carries. So in VEX, you can mark things like not affected, not used, right? Those types of descriptors. And the idea is that if you send the SBOM with the VEX, I have enough context not to have to come back to Chris with 10,000 things. Maybe I'll come back with 5 things. Maybe I just won't come back. But this is how you make this much more pragmatic and programmatic to be able to communicate risk along with all of the exceptions and the reason for exception, because I'm sure we will all agree, we will never ship vulnerability-free software as somebody may define in its kind of true sense. What you might be able to ship is software that is vulnerability-free from vulnerabilities that actually affect you and can affect your downstream customers. And that's kind of the goal of SBOM plus VEX, is being able to communicate that. Now, the problem in the industry, though, that we lack is 100 tools to generate SBOMs, really no tools to generate VEX automatically. So that's been a whole other area of research and development and focus for us, which people can read more about on the Endor Labs website.
Okay, so the perfect state in the future will be a tool that generates the VEX file automatically to determine. Now, what is it? What are the rules? What are the questions that tool has to ask to be able to determine if something is truly one of the 5 things I should care about or not?
Yeah. So think of it this way. Today, how do you manage exceptions internally, right? Internally between development teams and security teams, you probably have an exception register or JIRA tickets where you say, security says, fix this. Engineering says, I will not fix it. And here's the reason. And you say, okay, fine. It's automating that and annotating that That's the kind of information you put in a VEX. So
Okay.
VEX has a template, it has a format, it has reasons, right? Not affected, not reachable, bunch of stuff. And so with the CVEs, you could proactively say, look, this CVE, it's here in this library version, and here's the reason we're not fixing it. Now, can you automate 100% of it? Probably not. Can you automate 70, 80% of it? Yes, right? Like I already know if it's a test dependency or it's shipped in production. I already know if it's reachable or not reachable. I already know if the whole package is still being used or not in my application. I already know if there's a fix available or not available. Now, the things I might not know is the inputs to the application, right? Because some of these vulnerabilities are dependent on various inputs and other techniques. Or do you have any compensating controls in front of your application? That I might not be able to discover automatically, but your developers might know and security teams might know, so you can further annotate those. But if you can even generate 70, 80, 90% of the VEX automatically, that is a huge win for you.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's got to be 100% to be truly beneficial. Because in a DevOps world, right? And this is one of the problems I've had with SBOM. Okay. So I've become known as somebody who's not drinking the SBOM, whatever, like not getting excited about SBOM. Like I'm not that excited about it. But I believe in SBOM from the transparency where you kind of started this. I think that's crucial. I want transparency, but everybody's gotten so excited about SBOM. Like you said, there's hundreds of tools for generating the SBOMs formats. But the challenge is, I don't think people are going to use them. And I don't think people are going to get the value out of them based on the effort that is going into creating them. And Correct. So I look across the industry and everybody's SBOM positive and like, hey, we love SBOM. SBOM's the greatest thing. Like, no, SBOM is not going to solve all of our AppSec problems. I'm sorry, Correct. It's not going to. And it will provide transparency as long as an organization can find a way to consume it in such a way that it adds value. And you mentioned OWASP dependency track. That's an example of a way you can consume SBOMs and derive value from a collection of SBOMs. I get that. But I don't know. I mean, any thoughts based on my naysayer SBOM opinions?
Several thoughts. One, you're right. We talk to a lot of customers that are asking for SBOMs and we say, what do you do with them? Well, today the answer is I file them under a desk or file them under a virtual SharePoint desk and call it a day. They recognize that's a problem and they're going to get better at that. But here's my fundamental issue and why I call an SBOM a means to an end. By the time you generate an SBOM, like think about this. How much do you control the inputs of what went into your application? You're just now presenting the components in your application, but as a application security leader, how much did you control what came into this pipeline at the front gate of your house, right? You're just saying this is what's going out. Great, but at this point, it's a wall of shame. What we are really after is shifting that whole thing all the way left to the point in time when a developer says, I want to use a new open source project. Okay, great. What are you hoping to do? Well, I need a logging library in Go. Great. Let me help you. Let me recommend to you what you should use that I know will get a clean bill of health later, right? Like that's the early intervention. Or, here you have three choices between package A, package B, package C. Here's all the metrics on them. Here's like your, here's the human risk factors. Here are the people behind these projects. Here's how well the code is written. It's vulnerability free today. It has good documentation, good release practices, well supported. You should probably use it and you're likely to be okay. Like you need that early system engaged because that is when you control and can influence what goes into your application. Because otherwise you're just fighting the fire of applications getting shipped. Here's an SBOM. Holy shit, that SBOM showing me that I have a package that is 36 releases old. Like, why didn't we do something about it? Well, guess what? If I was reviewing the PRs when your developers were pushing this code, I could intervene very early, give them that input, and I wouldn't have this problem. So to me, SBOMs without this whole, what I call an open source governance program is, to your point, basically a check the box exercise. My hope is people will use these wall of shame reports initially that'll come out where people will get asked a lot of questions eventually when these come out of a file cabinet and get put in some system. Yeah. And that will force us all to have better governance and guardrails there, where the answer is not to not use open source, that would be a horrible outcome. Open source is generally good for humanity, but do it responsibly and do it confidently in a data-driven approach.
Yeah, our friend Izar Tarandash has made a shirt that says, "My threat model is better than your SBOM." Exactly. Like, it's because, to your point, like when I think about SBOMs, I mean, there are companies in the SaaS world that push 500 releases a day. If you don't have an automated high-speed way to process those as a consumer, you can't do it. If someone's filing 500 of these things under a desk, in your virtual desk kind of example, like that's zero value. And for big companies to create SBOM programs where they are releasing, building these things into their products. You think about big product companies with thousands of products. Yeah. Like, this is real money. It's real dollars associated with this. And so if we're not going to get the value out of it, if I'm a big company, I'm saying I'm not doing it. You prove to me that there's a value proposition. And I know what's happening is customers are saying, well, we're not going to buy if you don't have an SBOM. And companies are going to bend because they want to sell product at the end of the day, and they want to make money and all the other good stuff that comes from running a company. But if you're not getting benefit out of it, that's where I've been stuck. Is like, show me a way where we're getting the right amount of return on investment on my dollars, and then I'll become an SBOM. I'll wear a shirt that says SBOM. But right now I'm going to wear Izar's shirt that says my threat model is better than your SBOM.
Look, I think it's starting out as a compliance checkbox. It has to shift to real security. We actually wrote a blog post. People can check it out on our website. It's called SBOM versus SBOM, because we ran 3 of the most popular open source SBOM generation tools, and all 3 against the same application gave different results. So the big question is like, what do I believe? Right? So there's a whole attestation problem, accuracy problem. Lots of stuff has to be vetted out. In my opinion, the train's left the station. Like, yes, SBOM is now becoming a compliance necessity, but hopefully we'll take it much beyond that and not end it as being yet another compliance checkbox that doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah. I've said some of those same words as well. That was another conclusion that I had as well, is like, compliance is just not the way for true security. It never has been. And unfortunately, it's a minimum standard that's been applied, and we get some small security improvements out of compliance, but we definitely don't get a return on investment from a business perspective, where you can look at that and say, I invested this much money and it resulted in me getting this much gain for us as a company. It's not there in anything in compliance doesn't have a solid return on investment. It's more of a loss leader type of thing, where I have to do these things in order to sell. And so maybe you could say there was a return on investment, probably be zero actually, if I'm spending these things to try to sell my product.
Yeah, look, I think this is why, Chris and Robert, we started with developer productivity tax. Our mission in the world starts with that, because we think if you really drive the right outcomes, where you are minimizing the developer productivity tax, and along that way, checking those compliance boxes, along that way, improving the posture of risk, improving the resiliency of the applications. That's the focus. But I think today, starting a product or a company just focused on compliance, I'm not sure. I wouldn't personally do it. I think we're focused on much bigger issues in application security and developer productivity. Yeah,
you might as well have a result. You might as well do something that can change the world. Yep. Like, nobody starts a company. I mean, some people do start a company and say, I just want to build compliance into things. I don't know. That's, for me, I'm not going to get out of bed and be super excited in the morning. What are we doing? We're going to make another clipboard with a bunch of things on it we got to check off. That's what we're doing. Like, I don't know. I mean, you've built a number of companies. Yeah. There's something about building a company. You want to save the world. You want to do something of meaning. Like, you don't want to create a company that's just here to make more check boxes.
Yeah.
So are there any other tools or things that AppSec teams could use or should use?
Oh boy. I think the problem is there are too many tools that the AppSec teams can use, and the questions around consolidation. I think my thesis is the whole shift left movement has gone a little too far. In principle, 100% makes sense, right? Like, we got to do things early. We got to intervene early. Full believer in that. But the way we're doing that today is just so inefficient. Like, you have one tool you run in your pipeline for secrets, one for SaaS, one for SCA, another thing for IAC, another thing for container image scanning. And then your platform teams are so frustrated just managing these tools, and they don't have dedicated headcount to just run tooling for you and instrumentation for you. And so I think the right approach architecturally is to have this concept of a parallel security pipeline, which is basically to say, look, you instrument this one thing. This gives us the ability to hook in 30 tools if we want to, or put in one best of breed tool if we want to, however you want to do it. But you kind of abstract away the need for a platform engineer to have to go intervene every single time, every version update, every breaking change. And you kind of abstract that down to say, okay, as an SRE organization, you give me this hook into your pipeline. You tell me how much time I have, how much CPU, how much memory I have. And then let me as a security organization orchestrate the tools myself, independent of you, so I don't come bother you every single time. But we agree upon the constraints and confines. And you want to run 30 tools, have at it. You want to run one tool, that's your choice. You want to change a tool every month, you go do it as a security organization. But we kind of bring a little degree of separation and parallelization in the pipeline.
Do you see a consolidation coming in the market? I hadn't really thought about this until you were describing it in such a way of 18 different tools. But then you start to, my first reaction was, there's not that many. But then you start to list off the things like, okay, secrets management, infrastructure as code, SAST, IAST. You keep going down the list. There's more container scanning.
Yeah.
Is there a consolidation coming in our market?
Look, I think consolidation has always been an interesting point. If you look at what we did with Prisma Cloud, is we had a fundamental belief that customers will choose best of breed products. But what if you could integrate best of breed products into an integrated platform? So can you give both? Now, with the resources of Palo Alto Networks and the several acquisitions we made there, we did manage to deliver that. We think for a single company to try to do everything is nearly impossible. So then that means, how do you deliver similar outcomes, but give customers the flexibility to still apply best of breed tools? So I think where the opportunity lies is just like what Docker and containerization did to the world of compute, you could do on orchestrating security tools. This kind of goes back to my concept of parallel security pipelines. If we could give a container in your pipeline that could run whatever security tools you want to do, you simplify the deployment to one thing in the pipeline. So if you deploy this one hook, you can do whatever you want. There's also Gartner's whole new category of application security posture management. That's on the output side, right? So once I have all of the alerts, how do I aggregate them so the AppSec teams and developers don't have to go to 25 tools to review results? How do you deduplicate? I think that also makes sense. So the sensors, if in effect, the tools might be different, but they could get connected to one thing, right? Ultimately, and then just kind of plug and play. And then you have this ASBM concept that then brings all of the results from those tools back into a singular result set deduplicated for the user. That makes a lot of sense too. So I think it'll be, you be vendor agnostic if you want to be, and run whatever tools. Year one, you want to run tool A for SaaS. Year two, you want to switch it out. Complete flexibility with smart orchestration.
Mm-hmm. All right, Robert, it's time for the lightning round. So why don't you take us into the lightning round with Varun?
Okay. So we have a few questions that we typically ask. So first of all, what's your most controversial opinion on application security, and why do you hold this view?
I think similar to maybe some other people's beliefs, I think the software composition analysis market and the approach that we know, as we know of it today, scanning manifest files, is dead. We think you need to have a much smarter approach that is much more targeted to really understand issues related to the parts of the code that you use. That's one. We also fundamentally believe that, or I personally fundamentally believe that just focusing on license risks and vulnerability risks, as software composition tools have done, is not enough. The whole supply chain and software supply chain, each risk has a lot of unknowns, malware in packages, name confusion attacks, poorly maintained software, provenance issues. These are things your SCA tools that focus on license and vulnerabilities just don't catch. So I think and you're probably going to ask me another question related to this, but I think there's a better way than SCA. And it's kind of like the shift we saw in the endpoint market, where we moved from signature-based AV products to eventually now, EDR and XDR tools. We need to see that shift now around a lot of AST tools, especially around SCA.
Okay. All right, next question. What would it say if you could display a single message on a billboard at RSA or a Black Hat conference?
There's a better way than SCA to manage your open source risks.
Makes sense. All right. Last question is, what's your top recommendation for a book? It could be security, it could be something else. And why do you find it valuable?
Yeah, I'll give you two things. One is, a lot of people listening in here are probably security professionals who may, like me, want to move into entrepreneurship. They have great ideas. I find a book, The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. It's a great book if you kind of want to go down the entrepreneurship path and want to understand what the journey looks like. I think relevant to application security and software supply chain security that we just discussed, there's a new book by Chris Hughes and Tony Turner around software transparency and supply chain security in the era of software-driven society. I think that's a great read for people wanting to come up to speed with, like, what the heck is this software supply chain security thing, and why is everybody in the world fixated on this over the last 2 years? It's a great read.
Cool. Yeah, Tony Turner is a past guest. Chris Hughes is a future guest.
Yeah.
So I love that recommendation came full circle, and now I got to read the book. Like now I have many reasons to read the book.
Yeah.
All right, Varun. So from a key takeaway perspective, to finalize our conversation here, we talked about a lot of things, from developer productivity tax to CVSs to SBOMs to VEX to, what you would put on a billboard at the RSA conference. But what, kind of from a key takeaway perspective, what do you want to leave our audience with?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what we discussed, right? If the audience, a lot of listeners, your application security engineers, one, we have this whole concept of lean AppSec. Like, what we find is typically it's like one AppSec engineer to several hundred engineers. So how do you scale yourself? But also, how do you have empathy that the development teams don't have time to just chase your alerts and review code and then discuss and debate with you? So how do you bring in a lot of efficiencies into this process is a must today, in our opinion. And I think kind of more, kind of refreshed approaches around things like SCA that we discussed, and more simplification of the pipelines, I think is going to be critical to scaling any application security program moving forward. So, feel free to, ping me on LinkedIn if you're interested in chatting more about this subject. I have lots of thoughts and opinions on this, or, check out a lot of great technical content on the Endor Labs website. We also recently did a Lean AppSec conference, virtual conference. You had great speakers and practitioners. If people want to know more about the concepts I've discussed, feel free to take a look at that content that's available on demand.
All right. Thanks, Varun, for being a guest, for walking us through and teaching us about VEX. Well, as Robert and I have admitted, we didn't really know a lot about it, so it's helpful to get that perspective. But thanks for being a guest on the Application Security Podcast, and we look forward to a future conversation on some other topic.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and have a great trip, Robert.
Thank you.